Uh, it's great to be here today. This is a really exciting topic. I know it has really captured the attention of Wisconsinites and really folks around much of the country. It's really dominating the news cycle at the moment, and there's a lot of buzz out there about it. So we're going to dive into it and really talk about this insect and really getting a better understanding of its truly unique biology and some of the patterns that we see with it. I feel it's a really relevant topic for two reasons. First is that very soon, within about the next 2 weeks, these insects are going to start to emerge in Wisconsin. But also about a month ago, we had that total solar eclipse, which we didn't quite get here in Wisconsin. We got like 90-ish%, depending on where you were. But with that solar eclipse, I know folks that traveled hours or sometimes days just to be able to witness that phenomenon. And ask yourself, how many times in your life do you have the opportunity to witness something like a total solar eclipse? I know there's articles about it, and you can go chasing around the globe to see some of these on occasion, but it's somewhat similar with these periodical cicadas. So in Wisconsin, we only have one single group or brood of these insects. That's brood 13, and we'll talk about all those details in a little bit. But these insects have a 17-year life cycle. And so if you think about it, for someone that lives in Wisconsin their entire lives, you might only have 3, 4, 5 or so opportunities to see these insects in the Badger State in your entire life. So that's a really special, unique thing that we have an opportunity to witness this year. So let's dive into it. One quick thing before I do that, though, and start talking about what cicadas are. Now, I do want to mention, and I'll put this up on my final slide, we do have a Wisconsin periodical cicada website, which is cicadas.wisc.edu. All sorts of cicada information on there. So let's jump in with talking about, first and foremost, what's a cicada. So they're obviously insects, but they belong to a larger group we call the order Hemiptera. These are insects that generally have sucking type mouth parts. So it's somewhat like the tubular mouth parts of a mosquito, but the members of this group all have those mouth parts. And the order Hemiptera includes some other everyday insects you've probably heard of or are familiar with, things like aphids, stink bugs, leafhoppers, spittle bugs, and others. But within that group, there's one specific family, the family Cicadidae, and these are our cicadas. Now, in North America, we've got about 170 species or so, but worldwide, there's actually close to 3,500 known cicada species. So we've got a lot in North America, but many, many more when you go around the globe. Now, in general, cicadas tend to be pretty large, robust insects. Often an inch or more in length. There are technically some smaller ones. There's a type called small grass cicadas, which might only be in the range of about 3/4 of an inch long. But the common ones that we bump into in North America, especially in the upper Midwest, they tend to be an inch or more in length or somewhere in that range of size. They are large, thick, robust insects. They have a very wide body, wide head. They have 2 pairs of thin, membranous, translucent wings as adults, and these are held kind of tent-like over the back of their body. So we can see that very well in the picture right here. And then they also have these prominent bulging eyes, which stand out very well in this picture as well. A couple other unique features of their anatomy. They've got these 2 very short, stubby, thin or cetaceous antennae. And we can see those popping out right in front of the eyes in this picture that came up on the screen. And then another unique feature you'll notice on the face or the front of the head of this insect, there's this grill or radiator-like structure that's actually the swollen bulbous structure called the clypeus. It sticks out because inside there's a lot of musculature. That is basically a pumping mechanism to control the flow of liquids going up through these slender tubular mouth parts. And in this photo, you can see those slender tubular mouth parts. They're sticking backwards between the legs of the insects. This is like a long straw that they can use to drink fluids. Now, the adults don't really do all that much feeding, but the juveniles have very similar mouth parts, and they do the bulk of the feeding that these insects do. So that's generally what an insect is as the adult stage, or I'm sorry, what a cicada is as the adult. These are the juveniles. They can be pretty good size as far as our insects go, often up to about 1 inch or more in length. And generally they have a brownish coloration, and they're kind of arched or humpbacked, if you will, and might remind you a little bit of a crayfish in terms of their general appearance, and the way that their forelegs, their structures, might remind you a little bit of claws of a crayfish, for example. Just like the adults, these have thick bodies, thick heads with prominent eyes. We can see that in this particular photo right here. As juveniles, they are wingless, but I will point out, so this is a mature juvenile, or nymph as they're technically called, that has left the soil, because these are soil dwelling as juveniles. This one has left the soil because it's ready to molt and transform to the adult stage. When they're nearly ready to transform to the adult stage, they'll have structures that resemble wings. These are kind of these little wing pads or wing buds. Those are the tissues that when the adult emerges, the wings will be in those locations. But as juveniles, they don't have fully formed wings, and they live below ground. They'd have no need for wings. So if you ever see an adult or an insect that's flying, we know it's an adult insect. Only adult insects have fully formed, fully functional wings. Just like the adults, these have the bulging radiator or grill-like structure called the clypeus that contains muscles for the pumping mechanism so they can drink sap from tree roots, and they also have tubular mouth parts. Another thing to point out about the juveniles, and this is different than the adults, with the juveniles, they have specially adapted fossorial forelegs. Fossorial is in reference to digging, and these forelegs are specialized in flatten and enlarge to allow them to dig and tunnel through the soil. Versus if you take a look at their middle and hind legs, those are thin and tubular. It would be like if you or I went to our garden and we tried just digging with a stick. That's not going to work very well. But if we use a shovel with a flat surface, more surface area, that's going to be much better for digging. So juveniles spend most of their time, actually almost their entire life for the most part, below ground, feeding on the roots of plants such as trees. So their job is to feed, grow, and develop. But all cicada juveniles are going to look something like this. Now, before we dive deeper into the periodical cicadas, I do want to talk about another type of cicada, which is really, really common in Wisconsin, in the Midwest, and many parts of the US. These are the dog day cicadas. These are the ones that we see every single year during the dog days this summer, and they make that constant buzzsaw buzzing noise, but even higher pitched than that. That's a very common sound that we often hear during the months of July, August, September. This is members of the genus Neotibus, and we also commonly refer to these as annual cicadas because we see them every single year or on an annual basis. They actually have life cycles that can range from maybe 2 to upwards of 5-ish years, depending on the species and where they're located. But due to overlapping generations, some of these come out every single year. Now, we've all seen these. Most likely, they are large, robust insects. They're generally dark colored, blackish, and maybe grayish or beigeish on the body. The wings have some olive greenish on the veins, so they have a greenish coloration to those wings. And then the eyes themselves, which are prominent and bulging, they're dark colored, and that's going to differ compared to the periodical cicadas we'll talk about momentarily. So these are very common, widely distributed, but they typically emerge in small numbers. And again, it's more of an insect out in mid and late summer. So later half of July and August and September. Again, it's during those hot dog days this summer, hence the name dog day cicada. And in my own yard, I see these every year around a particular tree where my son's swing is located. And I might see an old exoskeleton or exuvia here, one there. Maybe I'll see a dozen or 2 dozen total. But again, these emerge in relatively small numbers. What we are here to talk about today would be the periodical cicadas. This is a different genus or group of cicadas. It's the genus Magicicada. And notice there's the word magic in there because they do have somewhat magical life cycles. These in general tend to be a little bit smaller than our periodical cicadas. Depends on the exact species, but often more the range of 1 inch to maybe 1 inch and a quarter, so slightly smaller. The appearance and coloration is very different though. They have black bodies with orange on the legs and the wing veins, and their eyes, especially on fresh live specimens, are a very vibrant red color. One other thing I want to point out about the veins on the wings of these insects is there's usually a darkened W shape pattern present. And we'll come back to that in just a moment, but that's another clue as well. But again, the black body, orange on the wings and legs, prominent red bulging eyes, very, very unique appearance, identifies these as periodical cicadas. Now, these insects, this group of insects, genus Madge cicada, they only occur in the eastern US. That's the only place in the planet where we see these insects that have these long extended 13 or 17-year life cycle. And that's why we use the term periodical. They don't come out on an annual basis in a given spot. It's every once in a while, either 13 or 17 years, depending on where you are and the species involved. Now, also to contrast these to the annual or dog day cicadas, these emerge earlier in the year, generally in spring. Depends on where you're located in the US. Southern areas, they've been out for a while, maybe popping out in parts of April. But here in the upper Midwest, we're just getting to that point where they're going to be coming out. So very soon in late May and into the month of June is when these insects are active. And for Wisconsin, at least, as we get into July, they're wrapping up, they're going to die off, and we won't see them again for 17 more years. So not only do they emerge at these very unique long time intervals, 17 years for us in Wisconsin, but they don't emerge in small trivial numbers. They emerge in massive numbers. We're talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands in individual yards sometimes. And if you're talking about a specific area, such as a small town, you can get millions, tens of millions of these. So this year in general, with two different groups of periodical cicadas coming out in the US, we are talking about billions and really trillions of these insects that are emerging in the eastern US this year. So that's really a unique experience. Now, taking a closer look at the periodical cicadas, splitting some fine hairs here, there are actually technically 7 different species of periodical cicadas, although to just the general public, they're all going to look pretty similar. And in the keys and taxonomic guides used to separate them, usually the first question is it a 13 or 17-year species? There are some then subtle differences in the coloration of the body, especially the underside of the abdomen, that can tell them apart. They also can be separated by the songs or sounds that they produce. But there's 3 species with a 17-year life cycle: Madge cicada septendecim, we'll talk about in a moment, Cassini and Septendecula. And then there's 4 species that go through 13-year life cycles, and we don't get these in Wisconsin because we don't have 13-year cicadas here, but Madge cicada tridecim, neotridecim, Trida cassini, and Tridecula. So it's not just one species of periodical cicada, it's actually 7 total, but for Wisconsin with our group, we can potentially see up to 3 of these species with their 17-year life cycles. But this is one I want to single out and mention. This is Madge cicada septendecim. This is commonly known as the pharaoh cicada because of the song that it produces. And in general, this seems to be our commonest species of periodical cicada in Wisconsin. And this is one that actually, if you train your eye to look for it, you can identify the species pretty readily with the naked eye. It turns out that just behind the reddish eye, between that and the base of the wing, there is a rusty reddish patch where that arrow is pointing right there. You can see that orangish, brownish, reddish patch. On the other cicada species, it's simply going to be blackish in that area. So if you see that orangish, reddish patch between the eye and the wing, that lets you know it's Madge cicada septendecim. These are about 1.25 inches long. Again, they've got that distinctive reddish patch behind the red eye. And they get their name because of their song. It sounds like someone is saying pharaoh, although a really drawn out extended version, or pharaoh, would be like pharaoh. That is essentially what their song sounds like. And if you go online, including on my periodical cicada website, I do have some clips of what that can sound like. Now, when I did some digging earlier this year, I checked in at the Wisconsin Insect Research Collection. This is our collection on the UW-Madison campus that has millions of curated specimens. All the specimens we had in the collection of periodical cicadas from Wisconsin happen to be this particular species. So again, this seems to be the commonest, most abundant species in Wisconsin. It's possible that the other 2 17-year species might not be here, or if they're here, they might be present in lower numbers. But again, this seems to be the top species that we bump into in the state. Now, I mentioned this before, but periodical cicadas, wow, this is a timely topic because we have these emerging in Wisconsin here very shortly. But there's not just one group of cicadas emerging this year in the US, but actually two. We're talking about Broods 13 and Brood 19, and these are numbered with Roman numerals to help us better keep track of them. The Brood 13 has a 17-year life cycle, Brood 19 has a 13-year life cycle. And so if you were to count backwards, the last time those two groups would have synced up was 1803, when Thomas Jefferson was president and the Louisiana Purchase was a brand new thing to our country. So as you can imagine, the US looked very, very different at the time. Also, if we count ahead, 13 times 17, 221, the next time these will be out together will be in 2245. So this phenomenon this year, it's truly a once in a lifetime opportunity because our grandkids will not see these two broods emerge. You'd have to go ahead to 2245 to see this same two groups emerge in the same year. Now, in general, there's a whole bunch of these different groups or cohorts or what we refer to as broods of periodical cicadas. I mentioned earlier that these only occur in the eastern half of the US. Basically, you get to the Great Plains and west of there, we don't have them. It makes total sense because these insects are associated with the roots of trees. And so you get to the Great Plains where historically it was grasslands and prairie. These insects don't have what they need. So restricted to the eastern US. Total today, there are 15 broods or cohorts. And this is a really cool color-coded map from the US Forest Service. You've maybe seen this making the rounds in news stories. Overall, there are 12 broods that have a 17-year life cycle. And in general, these have a more northern distribution. And then there are 3 broods with a 13-year life cycle, and those have a more southern distribution. So on this color-coded map, the 3 groups with a 13-year life cycle would be the light blue, that's Brood 19 popping out this year. They occur in southern half of Illinois and Missouri, and then all the way over into the Carolinas, and then also that olive green along the Mississippi River, and then the little pink patch down in Louisiana and Mississippi, that's the third 13-year brood. All the other colors refer to 17-year groups or broods of these insects. Now, this is a timely topic for us this year, 2024, but this is not the first time that humans have wondered about these insects. It turns out if you dive into the history books, the very first written record of periodical cicadas dates back to the time of the first European settlers coming over to the Plymouth colony. 1630s was the first written record of these insects. This is a note from a book written by William Bradford, the governor of Plymouth colony. And he wrote, "In ye spring before, especially all ye month of May, there was such a quantity of a great sort of flies, like for bigness to wasps or bumblebees, which came out of holes in ye ground and replenished all ye woods. And eat ye green things, and made such a constant yelling noise as made all ye woods ring of them, and ready to deaf ye hearers. They have not by ye English been heard or seen before or since." Makes me think of reading Shakespeare in high school or college English classes. That Old English is a little bit hard to stumble through, but this was the first written record of these insects. Of course, Native Americans were here when Europeans came over, and the Native Americans very much were aware of these insects, but this was the first time someone had written documentation of these. Now, also keep in mind, I mentioned a couple of minutes ago that these insects only occur in the eastern half of the US. So imagine coming over from Europe and seeing these for the first time. Your mind would be blown. Like, what are these things? Why are they here in such huge numbers? And so this was really a tremendous, interesting thing. So starting in about the 1630s, going towards today, that's about 400 years of folks looking at and learning about and studying these insects. So there's a long history associated with these, but there's also a lot of mysteries and inaccuracies out there. So as you could imagine, these insects with their long life cycles, they were very difficult to study and understand. Also, when you think about the human lifespan in the colonial times, Today, we live much longer, often into 70s or 80s, but much shorter lifespan there. And so you might only get once or twice in your life to see these things emerge going back into the 1600s. So that made them hard to study. There were also a lot of inaccuracies and confusions with these reports. Again, Europeans had never seen or written about these insects before, and so they just didn't know what to make of them. Also, I showed you that map with all the broods popping out at different times. That really confused folks for a long, long time. But in some of the early reports, these insects were referred to as flies under various spellings, or in some cases, locusts. And for a long time, they were referred to as 17-year locusts. Locusts, though, are technically a type of grasshopper. But as you could imagine, when you start using words like flies and locusts, there's a certain biblical reference there. We think of the plagues of Egypt. And so folks often thought of these in a negative light. Again, it could evoke some of those biblical scenes of insects emerging in tremendous numbers. And so historically, the emergence of these insects was sometimes linked to human diseases or blamed for human diseases. They were blamed for crop damage, whereas true locusts and grasshoppers could feed on and damage crops like corn and beans and stuff like that. These things wouldn't hurt those crops, so they kind of got a bad rap, and the confusion with the name might have mixed things up. And then in some cases, they were even blamed for or kind of served as a premonition of war. I mentioned a while back, there's kind of that dark W shape on the wings. And so when these would emerge, folks would say, oh, all these insects coming out, they've got a W on the wings. That must be a premonition of a coming war. And so they really had somewhat a negative connotation for a while. Again, the extended life cycles made it really difficult to study these things. You go back in the history books, and there was one gentleman who was writing a report about these, and he kind of figured out that 17-year life cycle, but he said, I really want to be sure. So what did he do? He waited 17 more years just to be certain before he published his report. Now imagine these days in the era of news reporting, folks are jockeying for position to be the very first to write the scoop for that particular story. And here's our folks saying, time out, I'm going to wait 17 years before I publish my report on these insects because I want to make sure it's accurate and correct. So it was difficult to study these. And if you missed them, you had to wait an awful long time before you could see them again. So with that said, again, 1630s, our first written reports through about the 1700s, many aspects of their basic biology and their life cycle were described. We're still learning more about them today, and there's researchers that specifically study these insects. We learn all the time, but by the 17 and 1800s, we were starting to get at least a decent grasp and understanding of these particular insects. This was a challenge, though, of simply keeping track of all these different groups or broods. And so it really was in the 1800s that folks started trying to accurately categorize these, and they would see them pop out in a given spot and label it with a number, for example. And so the first gentleman to do this was Asa Fitch, a very famous entomologist in American entomology, C.V. Riley, an even more famous entomologist, Benjamin Walsh. And so these guys all kind of independently or trying to improve upon each other, developed these numbering systems, but there were complications. 17 and 13-year broods were mixed together, and that kind of screwed things up. And so a gentleman by the name of Marlett in 1893 published the categorization scheme that we use today. And so this was his report, a new nomenclature for the broods of the periodical cicada. And so with that said, if you do happen to dig into some of the old cicada literature, you have to know who is writing it, because brood 5 under one author might refer to a different brood number under someone else. But our current conventional brood numbering system that we use today was developed back in the late 1800s. And basically what Marlett said is, he said, guys, we are going to take 1893. That's going to be our first year. And so if you are a 17-year cicada and you emerge in 1893, you're a brood 1. If you emerge the next year, 1894, you're brood 2. 1895, you're brood 3, and so on and so on. And he basically reserved 17 blocks of years for 17-year cicada broods. You could potentially have up to 17. And then if you emerged in 1893 and you were a 13-year cicada, you would be brood 18, counting all the way up to potentially brood 30. Now, a couple other things to point out. Not all years saw the emergence of periodical cicadas. So there are some Roman numerals in light gray those are years that didn't have an emergence. There's also two broods, brood 11 and brood 21, that previously existed and have now gone extinct. So at the moment, we have 15 existing broods, 12 that have 17-year life cycles, 3 that have 13-year life cycles. You might say, well, why keep all those other unused Roman numerals around? We'll come back to that in a little bit. It turns out these broods aren't entirely static and they could change over time. So in terms of keeping track of those different broods, again, it took folks a very, very long time to kind of map where these things occur over the course of different years. So U.S. Forest Service has this really great color-coded map, which I showed you, and this gives us a lot of insight into generally where these things occur, but this map does not account for local distribution. Also, this map shows historical distribution, and there's some locations where they have gone extinct in some areas. We'll talk about that again in a little bit. So this map is generally fairly stable, but it can change over time. Now, I mentioned this earlier, but again, the 17-year broods, there's 12 of those. Those tend to have a more northern distribution. So from places like Nebraska, Iowa, Wisconsin, over to the New England area, more northern 17-year broods. The 13-year broods tend to have a more southern distribution. Now, if we key in on that map, look at it just a little bit different way. This is from the Forest Service GIS website. This shows just this 2 broods that are coming out this year. So in brown, we have brood 13. Those are 17-year cicadas. In light blue, we have brood 19, the 13-year cicadas. And they do overlap a little bit in kind of east central Illinois, but for the most part, they are separated in space and time. So those blue areas, those cicadas have been out for a little while. For the Brown counties, brood 13, those are just starting to become active. And as you can see from the map, we do get them into parts of southern Wisconsin, although this map doesn't tell you the complete story. We'll come back to that in a little bit. So let's talk a little bit more about brood 13. This is the only group or brood of periodical cicadas to occur in Wisconsin. And it's commonly referred to as the Northern Illinois brood, because it happens to be centered around northern Illinois. It occurs in about the northern third or half or so of Illinois, also parts of eastern Iowa, far southern Wisconsin, a little northwest corner of Indiana, and historically, it occurred in part of southwest Michigan, although it's now thought that it's gone extinct in that part of its range because they haven't been spotted in southwest Michigan in a very long time. So over time, due to various reasons, the range of these insects is probably shrinking in some cases. Now, if we count backwards 17 years, we know they're coming out in 2024 this year. These insects last came out in 2007. Prior to that, 1990, 1973, 1956, 1939, 1922, 1905, 1888, 1871, 1854. So that's only 6 or so years after Wisconsin became a state. And then there was even a documented report of these from 1837, prior to statehood. So 1837 is actually the very first written documentation of brood 13. I do want to point out, though, that these things just don't appear out of the blue. They occur where they have historically occurred. And so with that said, brood 13 obviously existed prior to that point in time, and you could keep counting back 17 years and go back a very, very long ways. But 1837 was the first time that someone observed and wrote about these insects. But again, if we count backwards, they would have emerged in 1803 along with brood 19. So if we take a closer look at that map, again, we can see that range. They don't occur in southwestern Michigan anymore, but the southern roughly 2 rows of counties in Wisconsin, we do get them in the state. So let's dive into the biology of these insects in a little bit more detail, starting with their life cycle. So here we have a tree, and trees are a core element of the story of periodical cicadas. These insects feed on trees, specifically the tree roots, and they spend 95 to 99% of their entire life below ground as nymphs or juveniles feeding on the roots of trees. So at that point, their job is to feed, to grow, and develop. So they're down there in the dark, feeding on the roots of trees for 17 years. So basically their entire life. When they get to that year 17, they're ready to emerge. So those mature nymphs are going to crawl up above ground. They start making holes in the ground so they can come up more easily. Once they emerge, usually at night, they're going to molt. So they leave that old exoskeleton behind. We get our new adults we refer to as being teneral. They're very soft and pale colored. They'll eventually harden up. Once those mature adults are out, the males will start singing to attract females. They are going to mate. After mating, the females will go to twigs and small branches, insert her ovipositor or egg-laying structure to lay eggs. We then get the eggs within the twigs. Those are going to sit there in the twigs for maybe about a month and a half to 2-ish months before they hatch. And then the very young juveniles or nymphs basically drop down and rain down from the trees, land on the soil, burrow below ground, where they're going to hang out for 17 years. So these insects go through incomplete or gradual metamorphosis. Technically, it's referred to as parometabolous. So they go from eggs to nymphs, which generally look like the adults, but they're going to gradually get bigger and look more and more like the adults. And I will say the life cycle of all the periodical cicada species, all 7 of them, is basically the same. Now, I also want to point out that after the adults are out and about for roughly a month or so, they're going to perish. And so we're going to have all these old exoskeletons or exuviae and dead adults littering the ground, and that's going to return nutrients to the ecosystem. Now, what is the big emergence going to be like for us? This is going to be really a surreal experience if you haven't seen it before. And they've already started doing some of their activities. So usually a few weeks before these cicadas emerge, they start making tunnels up through the soil to the soil surface. I was just down in Lake Geneva a week ago and could see some of these holes. So that tells me they're coming out very soon. So they make these holes, and then when the time is just right, when the conditions are just right, they emerge typically at night. In tremendous numbers. You might get as many as 25 holes per square foot. So we're talking hundreds of thousands per acre. I did some rough calculations for my own yard. Now, I don't live in a cicada hotspot, but if I did, for the size of my yard, I could see upwards of maybe 250,000 of these insects emerging. I've got about a 1/4 acre lot or so if I had extremely dense populations of these. So in a given neighborhood or a city, we can be talking millions, tens of millions of these insects. So again, this year, we're really talking billions or trillions of them. So those nymphs or juveniles come above ground. They generally latch onto a vertical object, a tree trunk, a fence post, or whatnot. They molt, they leave the old exoskeleton behind, and they transform to that adult stage. Initially, they're very soft and pale. We refer to those as teneral, but they do darken and harden over time. Now, once they come out, things are actually relatively quiet for a few days. It takes the adult males 3 to maybe 5-ish days before they start singing. But once they start singing and making sound, it's going to be very, very loud for about a month or so. And those adults, again, they're active for roughly about a month. And they may do a little bit of feeding. It's more of ingesting to get the liquids to help prevent desiccation, perhaps. They do get a little bit in the contents of their gut. But otherwise, as adults, their main role is to mate, lay eggs, and then they're going to die. And we won't see them again for 17 more years. With the emergent holes, it looks like someone just took like a 1/2-inch drill bit or so into the ground. Sometimes there's actually these little chimney-like structures near those entrance holes as well. Now, this molting is a pretty cool process. And when you think about it, it's actually highly regulated by insect hormones. This is the process of them leaving that old exoskeleton behind and basically chemically producing a new one. As I mentioned, these insects emerge in huge numbers after dark. Usually, they're going to latch on a vertical object, a tree trunk or fence post. They're going to molt. That's what we see in the center photo right there. And then they have to hang there and allow their wings to expand. And it takes them a while to dry out, to harden and darken in color. So the next day, if you came back, those would have that black and orangish appearance. But when they first molt, they're very pale, whitish and yellow. And just to show you how that looks like in an animation, you can see that cicada splitting the exoskeleton kind of flops out almost upside down. And then it'll right itself and hang there and allow its wings to expand. This entire molting process coming out of that old exoskeleton can take a 1/2 hour or longer to actually pull off. So again, they're very, very vulnerable during this life stage. Now, a little bit about their courtship and mating. So we know that cicadas sing, and it's only the males that sing. It turns out that they have specialized structures on the side of their body called tymbals. These are a special membrane, and internally there are muscles that attach to these and can pull them inwards. And so those muscles contract and relax at a very, very high frequency. Another thing that's unique about the males is their abdomen is essentially hollow. So they have this sound echo chamber. So they've got these vibrating membranes like a membrane on a drum. They've got a hollow chamber to help with vibrations, and that allows them to produce sounds in the range of 80 to 100 decibels, depending on how close you are. I will say that the exact song of each species can differ depending on where you are and which species are present. There's that common pharaoh song, but there's other variations as well for different species. I also want to mention that the females can't sing. What she will do, though, is if she's receptive to a male, and the males are trying to belt out as loud as they can because that shows they have a lot of energy and they're robust and ready to mate. The female likes that. She's going to take her wings and flick them, and it makes a little snapping noise. That lets the male know she's interested. They may do a little bit of back and forth before they mate. I will also say there's no sound for this animation, but in the bottom right-hand corner, you see that male cicada's abdomen going up. They produce that noise. They lift up their abdomen to produce that noise, and then when it goes back down, they stop producing the noise. And there's some really cool video clips that I've got on the Wisconsin Periodical Cicada website. Now, I do want to mention briefly this strategy coming out in long time intervals in really big numbers. It's thought that that may serve as some sort of evolutionary strategy to help ensure success of the species. So if you emerge in huge numbers every single year, whatever feeds on you is going to catch on. That could be mammals or birds, reptiles, things like that. But if you emerge at these long time intervals, 13 or 17 years, for the most part, other than humans, a lot of our common vertebrates around here just aren't quite that long lived. So they can't have that memory going on. So that might help them out, but also emerging in huge numbers. If you come out in low numbers and you start singing and screaming, something's going to find you and eat you. But if you come out in such huge numbers that there's so many of you that even if lots get eaten, the predators essentially get a full belly. They're satiated. That ensures that there's plenty to go around mating. So it's thought that their life cycle, which is pretty unique, might be part of an evolutionary strategy. One other interesting thing I want to mention, they've got these 17-year life cycles for us here in Wisconsin, but occasionally periodical cicadas will pop out of sync or out of cycle. This usually occurs either 1 or 4 years early. And so in the last 4 or so years, I have had some documented cases in Wisconsin from Williams Bay, Lake Geneva area, a couple spots in Rock County, and then in Deerfield in Dane County. If these emerge in enough numbers, that can potentially lead to either new broods or shifts in brood, but you need enough critical mass. The reason I say that again is if you come out and start singing, something's probably going to eat you. So if small numbers come out, say 100, they're probably all going to get picked off. One really interesting thing, though, is back in 2020, there was a very large and pronounced emergence of stragglers in the Chicago area where there is going to be a big emergence this year. And there was perhaps enough of these cicadas in 2020 that enough might have survived predation to continue on that pattern. So scientists will be keeping a close eye on that to see if we get some emergence 17 years after that. That would be what, 2037. So that'll be really interesting to see if that happens. But that means that these broods aren't entirely static. They might be able to change over the course of our lives. It might be hard to see that, but when we think over the course of hundreds of years, centuries, those broods aren't entirely static. So I showed you the chart with all the brood numbers, and some aren't used. You might have asked, why not just get rid of those? Those could potentially be used at some point down the line if we get these shifts in life cycles. All right, so let's talk about experiencing these insects and this really cool natural phenomenon in Wisconsin. So let's talk about the when, first of all, because this is a little bit easier to talk about. The big emergence is going to be influenced by soil temperature and also weather to a certain extent. So we know from some research that the emergence of periodical cicadas is associated with soil temperatures reaching and exceeding 64 degrees Fahrenheit at a depth of 8 inches. So there is the Wisconsin Mesonet network of weather stations, and I've been keeping a close eye on that map. We can see for stations in southern Wisconsin, at the moment, we're in the high 50s. This was a snapshot from 9 p.m. last night, or in the low 60s, depending on daytime temperature. So we're getting close, but that soil temperature needs to creep up a little bit more. But looking at the weather patterns and forecasts for the next 10 days for Lake Geneva area, wouldn't surprise me if we started seeing emergence in Lake Geneva later this month, in the month of May, in about a week and a half. So stay tuned for that. They're going to be coming out very, very soon. The soil temperatures just need to warm up a little bit more. Now, that second question of where will these things emerge? So we know that they broadly occur in southern Wisconsin. This is from historical data going back over 100 years ago, but it doesn't tell the complete story, because it turns out these insects are restricted to very specific isolated spots. It's more like pins on a map, and shading in a county doesn't help you all that much. With that said, I live in Madison area. I could drive from Madison to see my folks in Racine County. I could drive for an hour and 45 minutes and never pass through an area with cicadas. So they're really, really spotty. And this has been known for a long time. So this is from Marlett, a well-known cicada researcher from the early 1900s. He wrote, as the periodical cicada is limited to forested areas, the broods occurring in prairie districts of northern Illinois and adjoining states are necessarily much broken and scattered, and brood 13 occurs, therefore, for the most part in small colonies in woods bordering streams. So we know there's a connection in wooded areas, also a connection with streams and rivers. We'll talk about that here momentarily. Another thing to keep in mind is that these insects, once they emerge, they really don't leave those sites. They come out, they've got just what they need, which is trees. And so they seem to pop up in the same spots again and again. They're not really colonizing new locations. So over time, through land use changes, their range might be shrinking. Now, you also have to keep in mind that the trees must be present for a long period of time. 17 years to complete at least one generation. If at any point in time those trees are cut down to make a cornfield or a parking lot or condos or a subdivision, those cicadas relying on those trees will die out. So over time, the range is probably very slowly and gradually shrinking. So let's take a closer look here at Wisconsin. So again, if I take a step back on that map, the brown counties, they don't really tell us the full picture. This last winter, I spent a lot of time digging through about 150 years of newspaper records, government reports and documents, records from the UW Insect Diagnostic Lab, from our Wisconsin Insect Research Collection and other locations, to come up with our most up-to-date map of periodical cicadas in the state. So these are locations where we have verified sightings of these insects. A couple of things I want to point out. So in general, the counties that are shaded had or have documented reports of periodical cicadas. So there are some counties that are grayish, like Lafayette, Columbia, Dodge, Jefferson, Waukesha, Milwaukee. Those counties have had historical records, but they haven't been formally documented in those locations in perhaps decades. And so we don't know if they even still exist in those areas. Through development and land use changes, they might have been wiped out in places like Milwaukee area, as an example, or Waukesha area. The counties that are blue are spots where we have had some recent records. Now on the map, and this can be found on the Wisconsin Periodical Cicada website, spots that are green have had verified reports and sightings or specimens collected in the last couple of emergence cycles. Spots that are light blue, we know there were historical records for them, but we're uncertain if they still occur in those locations or not. So I want to point out a couple of key things right here. If you are hoping to see these insects, we talked about timing. Late May, they're going to start popping out, and really the month of June is going to be a key period for us. But the key locations to look would be locations such as Lake Geneva, which is probably the single best spot in the entire state to see these. I know a lot of folks are going to be heading there, including myself, in a couple of weeks to go see and experience them for myself. Also areas like Janesville and Beloit. Near Janesville, just northwest of there, there's a location that had been a Boy Scout camp, Camp Indian Trails. It's now been purchased by the county. It's Rock River Heritage County Park. Big emergence noted there in 2007. Also places like the Spring Green area, and also a lot of little tucked away locations in the driftless region of southwestern Wisconsin. Now, remember, I just read that quote from early 1900s saying there was a connection with wooded areas and especially on along rivers. So we know places like Periodical and Boscoville and so on. There's some populations there. I have a suspicion, though, if you were to just drive around the driftless and spend a lot of time on rural county roads in the month of June, there's probably some other undetected populations that we just don't know about at this point. So that's kind of our latest understanding. I do want to point out some other important things about this map. So there are some key areas where we just don't know if these insects occur. So Lafayette County, where we look and they're in all the surrounding counties, Grant, Iowa, and Greene. I did get a report from a community science project I'll talk about. There may be a possible spot in the southwestern corner of the state, but I'm waiting to see reports this year to confirm. But again, locations like Waukesha and Milwaukee County, I have not seen any confirmed specimens or verified reports going back for 50 or plus years. So are they still present in those areas? We don't know. Also along those lines, I know there's probably folks from Madison area wondering about these. We knew historically they occurred in Madison. I've seen specimens that were collected in Madison. If you go on Fish Hatch, there's a DNR station south of the Beltline. They were noted in that area in about the 1950s and 1956 emergence, but they have not been seen in about 70 years or so. So we don't have any in the Madison area. There's one or two spots in Dane County where they at least have been spotted more recently, but big areas like Madison, Milwaukee, very unlikely that you would bump into these insects. Now let's talk a little bit about the ecology and the impacts of periodical cicadas. And one common question I've been getting is, well, are they good or bad? Well, let's just state some facts about them. First of all, they're non-toxic. They're really quite clumsy and defenseless. And from a standpoint of animals, they're very, very palatable. Lots of things are going to chow down on these insects when they come out. They don't bite, I suppose, in theory. If you picked one up and were mean to it and, ripping this or that off, it might try biting you. But even then, they're really kind of slow moving. So they really don't bite. They don't have a stinger. They can't sting you. They technically can cause some damage to plants, which we'll discuss here in a moment, but the impacts tend to be relatively minor. So looking at the bigger picture, the benefits of these insects seem to outweigh any harm that they might cause. So let's talk about the good impacts. They can benefit the soil. They're all tunneling out from below ground. At the moment, they're probably in the upper foot or so. The emergence tunnels, that's going to be like getting your lawn aerated. They're poking channels. That's going to allow oxygen and water to percolate into the soil more easily. Might even help with soil compaction to a certain extent when you think about it. Benefits to plants. The adults are going to be out for a month. They're going to die. That's natural fertilizer when you think about it. So those nutrients will break down and return to the ecosystem. We also have some social benefits in terms of insect tourism. I know locations like Lake Geneva are really gearing up and excited and welcoming visitors that want to see these periodical cicadas. UW Entomology is actually going to be hosting a cicada-themed pop-up event on June 8th. And so you're welcome to join us and have some guided walks and other activities related to cicadas. But perhaps the single biggest benefit these insects will provide is serving as a food source for wildlife. This is going to be a smorgasbord for pretty much anything with a mouth. Birds are going to chow down on these. If they fall into water, turtles and fish and other aquatic animals are going to feed on these. Mammals are going to feed on them, raccoons and skunks and squirrels and all sorts of other things. And technically, they're edible to humans too. So if you go online and search for it, there are cicada recipe books out there, and some folks are going to be trying them this year. Let's talk about a couple bad things that they can do. Well, first of all, when they pop out, they're going to be very, very loud. We're talking on the order of 80 to maybe 100 decibels. If you're up close, that can cause some nuisance issues. They're also going to be massively abundant. So if you live in a cicada hotspot and you have a lot of these, you might need to take a snow shovel or a broom to physically clear off your sidewalk or your driveway. So there's going to be some nuisance factors that could interfere with outdoor events, outdoor concerts, outdoor graduation parties, or weddings. It's going to be hard to hear the DJ over cicadas buzzing at 80, 90 decibels, for example. Also, once that cicada party is over and those adults, their time is up, they're going to die. There's probably going to be some odor associated with that. So that's, something that people won't like, but keep in mind, those nutrients are breaking down, returning to the ecosystem. And then one potential concern is plant damage. So they don't cause damage through the feeding of the adults, and below ground, the juveniles, when they feed, the plants do just fine. They tolerate that damage very, very well. The way that they can damage plants, so as adults, is after mating, the females have a structure called an ovipositor. That's her egg-laying structure. It looks just like a spear or a knife. She takes this and she cuts or slits into small branches. They really are fond of branches that are about 1/4 to 1/2 inch or so in diameter. And it would be like if I took a pocket knife and just kept cutting slits down those twigs. That might cause those twigs to break and die, and that can cause some issues. So as a result of this egg laying or oviposition activity, we can get some death of twigs and potentially small branches. Now, on large trees, when we see these twigs break and die and those leaves turn brown, we refer to that as flagging. So you can see that up close in the left-hand picture. On the center picture, you can see this happen to a patch of large trees, which is really going to catch your eye and be conspicuous. But some good news is these trees seem to do just fine in the long run. And actually, it's been noted in the cicada literature, this may serve as a natural pruning process, and it might even benefit those trees in the long run. It's been noted on fruit trees, for example, that trees that are affected with flagging injury might actually have higher fruit set the following year due to that pruning. There's one situation, though, where this could be problematic, and that would be with small trees. Because if these insects are damaging the outer 6 to 8 to 10 to 12 inches of twigs, on a big tree, that's a drop in the bucket. You'll see it, but it's a drop in the bucket. But on a small tree like the one on the right, if that happens all the way around the canopy, that could be a really high percentage of the overall canopy of that tree. We're talking maybe 2/3 of the tree being damaged. That's also going to impact the aesthetics and appearance of plants like that. So that would be one situation where they could be problematic. How could you go about remedying that situation? The absolute best approach is to get some fine mesh netting, 1/4 size or less. You drape it over the canopy of the tree, you tie it securely around the trunk of the tree, and you only need to do this for about a month or so when the adults are out and active. Once they die off, you can take it off and you don't have to worry about it for 17 more years. One other thing to consider, if you want to plant a tree this year and you live in a cicada hotspot, hold off until they're done in the month of July and then plant your tree to avoid damage entirely. There have been some studies that have looked at insecticides. Turns out they do not work very well at all in terms of preventing oviposition damage. So along those lines, I've been getting a lot of questions. Do I need to worry about my landscape plants? And the single most important question in my mind to ask is, were periodical cicadas present in your area during previous emergences, 1990 or 2007? If you answer no to that question, you didn't see them in 07, well, highly unlikely you would see them this year, again, because these insects occur in the same spots again and again. So if you aren't in a cicada spot last time or the time before that, you're not going to see these insects this year. There's really no need for concern. So in a place like Madison, you can net your trees if you want to. I've also got shark repellent I can sell you. You're just not going to need either of those. If you say, yes, I live in a spot where there were cicadas in 1990 and 2007, well, you are in a cicada hotspot. You could see some damage this year. The next question I would ask is, what size are your plants? If you're talking big trees, 30, 40, 50 feet tall, those trees seem to tolerate this damage just fine. Really don't need to do anything in a case like that. If you're talking about small trees or maybe some woody shrubs, well, then there could be some concerns there. And that's where you would want to either delay planting of new plants or cover those plants with fine mesh netting and secure it down at the base of those plants. That mesh netting will serve as a barrier. If the insects can't get to the plants, they can't harm those plants. And then just to wrap some things up here, I do want to mention from an ecological standpoint, some threats that cicadas face. In general, lots of things are going to chow down on them, but in terms of predation, their sheer numbers usually allow them to do just fine because they can overwhelm and satiate the predator. So that's one challenge in how they overcome it. There is actually a fungal disease, Massospora, that can literally turn these insects into zombies. It produces some chemical, alters their behavior, and do some quirky stuff. That is something that can affect these cicadas. If you see a cicada that looks like it's got some fuzzy whitish fungal spores on the butt end of it, that would be this particular fungal disease. Perhaps the single biggest immediate threat, though, in my mind, would be habitat loss and land use changes. Again, if trees where there are cicadas present are cut down, those cicadas will die out. So over time, their range is probably shrinking. And then one other threat to cicadas, which we don't know exactly how it's going to play out, climate change. That may lead to earlier emergences. But if we get greater variability in weather patterns, is that going to throw a monkey wrench into their patterns of emergence? So we have to stay tuned, but they're probably going to at least see some earlier emergences of these insects. And with that said, just to wrap some things up, some key things I'd like you to know about periodical cicadas. Again, for Wisconsin, they're going to be out in late May and in the month of June, but they're really restricted to isolated spots on the map. So head to my website. I've got that map that I showed you. That site history is a key factor. If you didn't see them in your yard or neighborhood in 07, almost certainly you're not going to see them this year because they're really not colonizing new sites. And then the last thing is they're generally harmless and not need for concern. Couple of resources I'd like to mention. I mentioned this one already, but the Wisconsin Periodical Cicada website, cicadas.wisc.edu. This is a comprehensive source of information about these insects in the state. All sorts of cool information about their biology and their behavior. There's audio clips. There's some really cool videos, including historic ones. There are maps that I talked about and a frequently asked questions section and more. Also on that site, just putting a plug in for this, I have developed a community or citizen science project. I would love to hear about your sightings of periodical cicadas. There's some other efforts out there like the app Cicada Safari, but if you head to the cicadas.wisc.edu, in the menu bar, it says submit your sightings. You can click there. There's a fillable form. You only have to answer a handful of questions and upload some photos. I just want to know where and when they were spotted, roughly how many you saw. That will allow me to more precisely fine-tune our map of the distribution of these insects in Wisconsin. So again, I'd really love to hear about your sightings of these, especially if it's in parts of the state where we don't have a very good record of them previously. And with that, I know I am short on time, but I think we have a little bit of time for questions. I've got all my contact information up there. And again, the website URL for the Wisconsin Periodical Cicada website. Otherwise, I'd like to thank you all for joining me today and for your attention and interest to learn about these fascinating creatures.
Thank you so much, PJ. What a very thorough presentation. You actually did an amazing job of answering most of the questions that came into our Q&A box throughout your presentation, I believe. We do have just a minute here. We could probably ask one more that I thought was pretty pertinent. Are there any specific varieties of trees? I know you mentioned the size of the branches, PJ, but are there specific maples, oaks? Is there specific types of varieties of plants that these cicadas like?
Yeah, great question. I've seen in the literature, they've been noted on really a pretty wide range of like hardwood trees and some shrubs as well. I think of the main association being trees, of course. Oaks do seem to come up again and again, but they can be associated with other common hardwood species. So elms and maples and so on. If you're in a hot spot and you have a variety of trees, I would suspect they'd potentially all be able to serve as a host for these, other than maybe conifers. They don't seem to like those a whole lot, but your common hardwoods like oaks and maples and others seem to be very suitable for these insects.
Great. Well, as I said, you covered most of the other questions. The number one, I think the other one was just how do we treat them with the netting, especially young trees, not to worry about older trees. But we would like to thank everyone for coming. Thank you, PJ, so much for your presentation. We would also like to remind you to check out that link in the chat box to our survey. Please fill that out and give us some feedback. We really appreciate that for our future programming. And we wish everyone happy cicada hunting. And don't forget to report your sightings. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, PJ.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.